Thank you very much for this book launch to Marcela, Yanis, and Moderna Galerija. I began working on this project many, many years ago, and at that time, the discussion that was kind of held was first around, the shock of Snowden revelations, where people first became aware of this massive gathering of data, personal data and analysis, and this kind of huge spying operation that was going on. So then we had the scandal of political personalization, the idea that you would have a, personal political messaging that could influence how you vote. So this kind of huge, and the terms at the time were big data and data analytics. And then slowly, the idea, became about data patterns, identifying patterns and predicting on the basis of these patterns, which were associated with machine learning. And now this is, known as AI. So it was quite a long process, but the processes of analysis of this data that we leave behind and that somehow come back to us have been described and discussed for quite a while politically and also in scholarly literature. And the way people approach this were usually around this idea of digital self or your data shadow, an idea that you have a copy of you, that all your actions, whatever you scroll, whatever you look at, whatever you write or buy is recorded somewhere, and it's some kind of box, that the spy, a box with your name on it that a spy assembles and has a complete picture of your personality. I think this is a lot of the imaginary around these processes are shaped by this idea of having intimate access to who you are. And these are the books that came out meanwhile while I was working on this topic, and they really represent this kind of thinking. We are data, how we became our data. And a lot of these books, the majority of them, would be looking at the processes through which data is collected, how we are surveyed. And some of them would specifically make a claim that they're not interested in the metaphysics of the subject. Like Koopman's book, he talks about like the history of surveillance of neighborhoods, so the history of gathering data and how documents turned into data. But he's kind of specifically saying in the introduction, I'm not interested in the metaphysics of the subject, what it does to subject formation. And I think we actually need a bit of metaphysics of the subject. So I felt like none of these accounts, although some of them are very interesting, they still have these limits of failing to explain the non-coincidence with your data, failing to explain how it really draws you in ways that are not based on some kind of adherence to the liberal idea of the subject as this coherent entity, and how what actually happens that is like full of conflict. I felt like this is not really explained. And the way I came to this is that when I was beginning to work on this project, I had a PhD student who was working in digital marketing while doing her PhD. And one day she came to me and said, "Oh, I've been at the lecture by an American advertising company called MaxPoint. It just came into London market, European market. It was entering kind of this digital marketing space. And this woman doing a lecture presented the new tools. So the lecture was showing that what kind of data MaxPoint has access to, that it has, cookies are dead. There's no more about cookies or third-party cookie. Is really demographic, psychographic data, purchase data, all bank data, bank transaction data, search data, interest data through your kind of browsing history, your emails, and they're able to get a hold of that data, combine it, and make custom-made products targeting specific kinds of people using this kind of data. So the lecturer was showing that, and then she was talking about digital zips. It's like a product of that is offered that about targeting neighborhoods and finding commonalities in people's behavior who live nearby. And then the lecturer was showing like a certain map of certain area and started demonstrating the software capacities of their products. She was describing this house, and she was saying, oh, there's this house on the South London street, and a person who lives there is most likely a woman who buys organic vegetables, is not on Twitter, buys books, travels on London public transport. It was describing like this character. And my student said that she recognized me in that lecture. She said, it was you. So I thought, what does it mean? What does it mean that she recognized me in this kind of data entity? How is it constructed outside of my awareness, completely without my, permission or without my kind of agency? But also, how does it work? Obviously, it's a certain kind of digital subject that is constructed at a certain distance from me, that then can act on my behalf, represent me for like government planning for my neighborhood, or maybe it gets to be active in like banking decisions about my life or healthcare. So, and how many of these eyes are out there that are kind of working, but also it kind of relies on me. Obviously, it's made from some of my data, but also it's kind of not me. I don't agree that it was me. And how does it come back to me? Is it only through this kind of negation of my life, like violence, or there are other forms in which it works? So the more I was thinking about it, the more I thought it was like some kind of weird Möbius strip. You try to travel from the starting point to this data computational abstraction and back, and you're always on the wrong side, because it is never really a coincidence, or you can't say that one thing translates to the other. I think the indexicality there is very problematic, and I just thought this is a really obscure process. First, you don't understand it computationally, but then you also don't know how it works politically or aesthetically, what it actually does, and how does it work, and what are these things, if we think of them philosophically, these subjects, digital subjects. So that was the interest that drove this project, that event. And then I started thinking, how do we call this thing? Is it, data self, data shadow? I wasn't really satisfied about this. So then I read this little article by Gilles Deleuze. This is probably his shortest thing he ever wrote. It's 1 page long in a book published in 1991, probably one of his last things he wrote, the book called Who Comes After the Subject. And he has this 1 page article on the subject. And there he says, the concept of the subject has for a long time fulfilled 2 functions. First, a function of universalization in a field where the universal was no longer represented by objective essentials, and a function of individuation in a field where the individual can no longer be a thing or a soul, but is instead a person, alive and sentient, speaking and spoken to. Are these 2 aspects of the subject, the universal I and the individual me, necessarily linked? And even if they are, isn't there a conflict between them, and how it might be solved? And I decided that for my purposes, although the term subject and this concept has been, a very problematic concept and has been criticized in theory for all the right reasons, but it just simply wouldn't go away, and that really fits the problem I'm trying to describe. Because on the one hand, you have this kind of sense of subjectivity and interiority of self that gives me the kind of the right, the need to reject or in any way deal with this data entity, computational entity that is presented as me. On the other hand, this entity in itself is a product of certain scientific processes, right? It's based on computational processes. It's quantified as data. Models are made out of data, then they're put through other kinds of processes, and then what is the result of it is something that we've been trained to really trust as objective or scientific. We modern people, we trust in science. And it is this kind of tension between the kind of deep sense of self and this kind of truth or objective evaluation that is presented to you as you, that is at the heart of this new phenomena of these digital subjects, or ideal subjects, as I call them. And this is what I try to describe throughout the book. So to give you another example of this, this is a Spotify Wrapped. And Spotify Wrapped is a product of Spotify that's delivered once a year to Spotify subscribers. I probably don't need to explain this to you. Every year they do it differently. In 2023, they presented your listening character to you in Spotify Wrapped. So usually you have an analysis of how many tracks you listen to and what are the most, beloved styles that you listen to during the year. But in that year specifically, they also created this kind of characterization of who you are as a listener. And there are like eight characters. And you can see here exactly what I'm talking about. So on one hand, there is your experience of music and listening to music for the whole year. And it's kind of counterposed or put into some kind of relation to this evaluation of your listening, which is objective in the sense that it's based on counting or, some count to how many times you've listened to some tracks, but it's also subjective in a way that someone also designed these things. And this is some kind of banal aesthetics at work here who generates this kind of characters. And these are constantly kind of this movement between this kind of aesthetic sense of self, the kind of objective calculation, and then that comes back again to give you like the sense of self or offer like a version of who you could be. And I think this is an example of this dynamic between the kind of interiority of self that we are constantly furnishing and working on, thinking who we really are, in relation to these forms of truth making or forms of work that is based on calculation, computation, prediction, that then somehow now get related quite intimately to this kind of other axis of subjectivity. So the book has only 3 chapters. They are gigantic. And the first chapter looks at how digital subjects are made. So I look at how they are made as abstractions, first as categories and predictions, and I'll talk about it next. And the second chapter looks at how they come back to us. So here I really shift gear. I look at desire and how we start desiring these abstractions. How can it actually happen that our desire can be orientated towards results of computation? And how, as my student, when I'm teaching this work, and one of my students used this beautiful phrase that she says, the youth of today is craving profiling. So it's this kind of production, orchestration of desire towards results of evaluation, abstraction, profiling, and as also the practice of computational media today, and how we learned to do that. So there's a third chapter which looks at the body and how these abstractions get anchored through the idea of the kind of inescapable biology of the body. But I won't talk about this today, and I'll just only talk about this first chapter and the second chapter as first and second part. So as you might gather from what I've said, I really reject the idea that these digital subjects are mirrors of us or shadows of us or some kind of traces we leave that have indexical connections to us and point at us without any problem. I think there is a very convoluted process, and this is what I first look at. And I'm going to play the first minute of this artwork because it really gave me kind of the first impulse to create the kind of first set of concepts to understand this connection between people and their digital subjects. That is not a connection that can be described as a mirror or a trace.
A digital artifact is neither an object nor its representation but the distance between the two. In this way, a digital artifact exists somewhere between the two dictionary definitions of its material predecessor. 1. Any object made by human beings, especially with a view to subsequent use. 2. A spurious observation or result arising from preparatory or investigative procedures. It is neither the object nor the observation, but the record of how a specific mode of observation has interfaced with an object and its context. The artifacts under consideration here were recovered from the community site maintained by the Autodesk software 123D Catch, which automates the process of translating user-submitted photographs of people, places, and things into three-dimensional models. The logic of digital conservation would seem to defend its sites against every material stress. 3D models are not eaten away by time or biology, and they are not worn down by use, rather they proliferate because of it. Still, most of these artifacts apparently bear signs of deterioration and decay.
So it's the beginning of this video when the artists say the digital object is neither an object nor its representation, but the distance between the two was really inspirational for me because and I use the word distance, and I will show you how throughout the whole first chapter. The idea that you don't have a coincidence and you don't have a simple representational connection between, the human and the digital subject. I indebted to Val and Benenson for that. So if you think of how digital subjects are made and you think that maybe it's your data that is somehow recorded, that is your individual data and it relates to you directly, this is not the case. The digital subjects look like this. This is a project by the New Inquiry called Taxonomy of Humans according to Twitter. An Excel spreadsheet where 4,000 categories of subjects are listed, including like ridiculous subjects like people who buy cheese, is a kind of subject that offered there. So you have this kind of loose categories at the foundation of a digital user profile. So this is another example, and this is a basic Google Analytics, a result of a basic analysis. This is free Google Analytics viewer website. You can install a piece of software and Google will give you this very kind of foundational data on the visitors of your website. And you can see that the way data points are recorded are not personal in any way. They are recorded as part of categories, and the categories are also have this banal aesthetics in them. They're named in this weird way, like travel buff. It's like why buff? Technophiles or fashionistas, and all the data points are recorded as part of categories. The categories themselves are not fixed, so the categories may shift and be renamed, or new categories can be produced, and even old demographic categories that carried like such immense normative value, like gender or age, they are also quite dynamic here. You can see that this is like a male, the male category has included more sessions. The numbers are the sessions, the number of sessions that the person clicked as male, but if they start kind of behaving according to this software package as a female, the percentage would kind of shift and the gender would be adjusted. So you have this kind of very classic form of making sense of the world, which is categorization. And we know it from the classic Enlightenment period, where you have plants classification, or the classification by Diderot of human knowledge. And the basis of classification is that you have categories that are characteristic of groups. So you can't have a category which has one member, because it will be a failure of categorization as a mode of abstraction. But so if you look at something like this, you can see that the categories are still there. They are the basis of these processes, but they don't anymore carry the normative character or a normative force. They can be formed on any basis, but there's still a form of putting people in groups in relation to each other. And there's not ever at this level an individual category for you or an individual representation of you. So what happens is that there's another book that I read, I used extensively, Adrian Mackenzie's Machine Learners, quite early account of machine learning, which AI was called only like 5 years ago. And Adrian is an Australian scholar, and he writes about tables and categorization and producing this kind of tables as a form of knowledge and how they mutate with machine learning and AI. And he says machine learning traverses, juxtaposes, and superimposes various tables along different lines than those of the classical tables of the sciences. And he has this picture in his book as an explanation of how a table is transformed into a vector space, because what AI does, that it transposes tables onto vector space, and that's the basis for prediction. That's how ChatGPT works, And he says that elements of the table and relationships between them are transposed onto vector space and become vectors. And there's also a very good explanation of ChatGPT in 2023 from YouTube. This from YouTube by one of its developers at the time, Andrei Karpathy, who talks exactly about this in relation to language, how like a table of relations is then transposed onto vector space, and that gives you the ground for prediction of the next token, and that is how AI language is generated. So you have this kind of processes. So at first you have data points that are put into categories. The categories are very fluid and dynamic, and then they are projected into vector space, and then you have other patterns that are next to the patterns in those vector spaces, and that gives you the ground for prediction. So, for instance, Facebook has a service called lookalike audiences, which is a service that if you are a company and you have a website and you sell washing machines, and you have your database of people who bought things from you, who bought these washing machines, then so you have your custom audience, but you want obviously people who haven't yet bought washing machines, because you want to sell more of them. So you go to Facebook and say, this is my data set, and I need people who are like them, who will buy from me. And Facebook goes and compares your data set with whatever they have, you don't know, and comes up with this lookalike audience. And it could be, tightened or relaxed. It could be more lookalike or less lookalike. And that is the basis for a lot of advertisement and personalization on, in computational culture where we live now. It is this kind of prediction based on what someone can look like, maybe according to specific criteria. And I have another story, actually. This book is full of this personal anecdotes. I'm trying this new mode of writing, as kind of a mode of rhetoric, which is probably a bit different to kind of traditional theory. And there was this event, I was writing this book, and I bought maybe 2 dresses in online shops. And so the dresses arrive, and then within few days, I have like 15 catalogs of companies I have never heard about. Paper catalogs come through my door. And I thought, okay, so the shop must have sold my data, and I was modeled as a lookalike person who might, if I already bought something, I might want to buy something else from these other companies. And at the same time, my bank sent me a new card and canceled my old card. So the bank also modeled me at a risk of fraud. And you have this kind of predictions of the likelihood of me buying something, because if you don't know, in marketing, if you bought something, you're most likely to buy something else within the next 72 hours. And then the likelihood of consumption goes down. So you have this kind of processes of modeling which are of risk and fraud. The process of modeling me as a top spender, top 7 days spender, that is likely, that needs to be addressed immediately in the next 7 days. And then one of these catalogs on my table is from this company, and on the front page of it is the company is owned by the wife of ex-Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, who called on a Brexit referendum and was a Conservative Party leader. And so I sit at my, in my kitchen, and I have this woman's face on my table. I didn't invite her into my house. I would never buy anything from her company. This is not something that I would consider ever wearing. And then I'm also thinking, but if maybe the dresses I bought resemble conservative style, and what if not only algorithms but people would identify me in some way, somehow, displaying signals of like affinity with conservative, political statements. So or values. So you have this kind of weird Möbius strip again of like different kinds of processes and different kinds of relations and responses that you might have to it. And I have to say, of course, all of this is really related to like consumption and I don't know, very minuscule unpleasantness with like new bank card or whatever waste of paper. But of course, the processes that are much harsher and much darker, identifying someone as a threat to the state or to certain kind of political doctrine, and then kind of identifying them and attacking them. Computationally, the process is the same. You still would have this kind of categories and pattern detection of within the data, and then of course then you can individually target people, and computationally the process would be not at all different from how people are modeled as consumers. So the term I introduce in the first chapter to discuss this process of abstraction from me, towards this kind of digital subject that is always collective, is never at the level of the classical subject of modernity. It's always below the individual, is always above the individual, is always slightly group-like or collective, or really a kind of unconnected data points. And it kind of goes in this kind of loops, and then it comes back to me also through other kinds of processes. What I think needs to be emphasized here is that there is a distance in this construction. It is a construction, and distance allows you, if you allow for distance, it makes it politically potent. Basically means that you can intervene in this distance, and people do intervene. A banal example would be that you can use all kinds of software to hide your data, use a VPN, alternative infrastructures. You can really obfuscate, or you can play with this distance like many artists would do. You can really disrupt it. If you claim that there is no distance and the coincidence between you and this kind of data self, then there is no possibility of intervention. There's no politics there. But I think claiming and focusing on the distance is what gives opens possibilities for politics. And of course, also very interestingly, although it's a different distance, this distance is computational, partially at least it's political, but distance is also something that we are used to as modern subjects. And it's a different kind of distance, but I think it's not by chance that these subjects, digital subjects, work. And I think they work because they layer onto existing structures that we are kind of trained to function in. So Judith Butler, for instance, talks about this as a continuous topic in philosophy or theory, the formation of the subject. And Butler writes in another quite old book, The Psychic Life of Power, that the subject is founded on circumvolution, the turning back to see, to recognize, to present, to contemplate, to reflect on oneself. So this kind of distance of basically looking back at yourself, thinking in the evening, or what have I done today? Thinking about what do I want, has my life been so far? What have I achieved? All these kinds of forms of self-reflection that construct the subject, that have their own techniques. People wrote about them: the technique of diary, the technique of cursive writing, the kind of the practices of self-reflection. These are all practices of construction of this interiority of self and the space of inside the self that produce distance. And I think, and I'll talk a little bit about it soon, that the digital computational subjects work because we already used to this spaciousness kind of within us. And then you have this other form of spaciousness produced by computational abstraction, but we already have abstraction as part of making of who we are. So that was the first chapter. The second chapter, I look at desire. I use for this the work of Miguel de Bestegui, who does some kind of summary of Foucault, and maybe says, makes Foucault into someone that he is not, but I was not. But anyway, so the Bestegui talks about orchestration of desire and training of desire, and desire, a specific kind of desire, as a foundation for a certain kind of subject. So this desire is generally like this kind of directedness towards the world, the general energy of involvement. And then he says that, following, I don't know, Deleuze and many other people, that what we have is the world orchestration and training of desire towards specific things. He talks specifically about how, in what he calls a Western model, desire became the very form of relation of self to self. And this is to mean that we are trained to desire ourselves as subjects. We're constantly told that to be well mentally, to succeed in society, you need to really appraise yourself and love yourself and take care of yourself, and kind of desire and want to be this unique subject that has this kind of sense of self-affection and self-care and self-development. And this kind of focus on directedness towards the self is it's a historical phenomenon. It's not like natural in some way. It is something that is produced, and it is something that we practice. So at this point in my writing, I was quite stuck, because I had this real kind of insight. I thought about the distance and how the subjects are constructed through computational distance, which is also a distance of, modernity, of rationality, of thought, of introspection. But I couldn't quite find like a non-artificial way to connect those abstractions back to people. Because, theory can be, people can build all kinds of structures, but it has to, for it to work, it has to be a living thing and have a pulse. And then my artist friend recommended me this book, which is also quite old, it's from 1995 by Leonard Davis, who is a scholar of English. And that book was rejected by lots of publishers until it was published, I believe, by Verso. And it's considered one of the foundational texts in disability studies. In the book, he reflects partially on being raised by deaf parents and experience of deafness. So he has this idea about the production of ideal and norm and the transformation of the ideal. So here, Davis first says, before statistics appeared and this idea of prediction of making abstracting people into numbers and predicting them as numbers, you had a certain kind of society. And in that society, ideal was celestial, right? You have ideal that exists at the level of the divine. And so people on earth were all non-ideal. So there was no one who could be ideal or possess all the aspects of the ideal. So he says, for instance, for a sculpture of goddess Venus, you would have many women pose, because maybe one woman would have ideal breasts and another ideal stomach, but you could not have one model who would, have all aspects of the ideal. And when you have everyone, when you have ideal that exists only at the celestial level, it means that everyone is non-ideal and everyone is kind of defective in some way. And which means that people with disabilities, they exist on a continuum with all other kinds of people because everyone is non-ideal. And then Davis says statistics appears, and then it starts quantifying bodily capacity and creating another kind of ideal, which is the norm and the standard. So he writes, the concept of the norm, unlike that of an ideal, implies that the majority of the population must or should somehow be part of the norm. The norm pins down the majority of the population that falls under the arch of the standard bell-shaped curve. So you have the kind of standard distribution of data, classical bell-shaped curve, and what he says is that at this moment, the abnormal is born as something that falls outside of, the normal distribution, and that radically reconfigures also the social relations and the lives of disabled people. But also, of course, he writes that at this time, the ideal becomes first normal. So you have ideal citizen, which has, average intelligence, average height. So you have this kind of appearance of the ideal as not good because it's just a result of calculation, and it is a result of the calculation of the normal deviation. But then, of course, because statistics, when it was developed, was a eugenic enterprise, and the ideas, Galton, the founder of statistics, he wanted to improve the human race. So the average was not good enough. He wanted the best, the tallest, the brightest to march humanity forward. So Galton substituted a ranking for averaging, and you started having ranking instead of bell-shaped curve. So here you can also see that it's just put on a side, but the calculation and the production of the ideal started working in relation to the highest ranked. And so this, I think, is a very important moment, because on one hand, you have ideal that doesn't work anymore at the celestial or transcendental plane, but it becomes a form of abstraction that is produced through calculation and prediction. So the first you start understanding yourself and society through forms of calculation. and you start kind of becoming better self, and you can kind of improve society through calculative procedures. But then also at that point, this ideal becomes, because it's no longer celestial, and because it's no longer unattainable, it becomes tantalizing. So your desire becomes kind of activated and directed towards wanting this kind of mathematically produced best. Okay, so people say you can't change your IQ, maybe, but maybe your children can be really smart. It's like you have this kind of production of striving towards the evaluations that are offered to you as the best, or the truest, or the expression of what is good. And this is the moment, I think, where our kind of orientation towards the world, our desire, but also ways of understanding the self and what it is to be a good citizen or a good part of society becomes involved and kind of activated and orientated towards the results of mathematical statistical operations and later computational operations. And a new relation to the abstract becomes possible, one in which a modern kind of abstraction does not only interweave with desire, but stimulates its very formation and directs it, articulating the world to want in relation to the operational repertoire of the abstract. So, on one hand, it kind of sounds maybe complicated, but what I want to say is I think even such a simple thing as a test result in school is already something that trains you to evaluate your capacities in relation to a result of calculation of a certain kind of estimation of how well other children did, and then a grade is awarded, and that kind of makes a statement on who you are and has this kind of legacy in your life. So what I think is that what we have with AI and computational profiling and different kinds of pattern finding and propositions of who you are is a reformulation that builds on this history of desiring these forms of truth that come from practices of abstraction, practices of mathematics, that we simply continue desiring. Desiring doesn't mean that we just accept them. Desire is conflictual. You can reject them. You can fight against them. You can, but in any case, you have to deal with them somehow. And that's why I think there is this dynamic between kind of, like I said in the beginning, that my student said that she recognized this was me, but I thought like, no, it can't really be me. And this kind of, they're like kind of this digital abstract ideal subjects are like us, but they're not really us, because they are kind of abstracted from us and then they predict us, but they're also not us because they are forms of abstraction that we desire, or can articulate ourselves as, or become in relation to or against. And so I'm finishing. That's the last slide. I know I'm always that I put myself into trouble by saying something like this, that because then you ask me, so what are these different ideals for us to want? I don't have an answer for this. But I wanted to end on acknowledging that I think the work of art and culture was always to produce ideals and different kinds of ideals. And it hasn't finished, and that's also what sustains us. And it doesn't, those kinds of ideals produced by computational processes are not the only ones, and we can have and should produce and aspire to different ideals and better abstractions that, don't have to be as deadly as what we have now with AI. Thank you very much.